Hello guys. I said yesterday on the community page that I was going to be doing a kind of a Q&A. So here it is. I apologise if I've missed your questions. I'm currently checking it at 10 past 11 UK time. So if you've posted after that, then I will probably miss it. I'll do a check afterwards to make sure I haven't missed anything too significant. So first of all, I wanted to talk about just a couple of things that have been in the news really. The first thing that springs to mind is the coronavirus, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon, I think. And I think it's something that the internet is panicking over for no reason. I think Coach Red Pill put it right when he said, there's nothing you can do about it, so why worry? And I think by nature we're going to worry about such things. Disease is one of those things that really bothers us, but there's nothing we can really do about it. At the very least, I think China's just gone and lost the mandate of heaven. With any luck, God has sent this to yeet the Chinese government for, frankly, being worse than Stalin. Like some of the camps that they've got out in Xinjiang, I think it's called, and the destruction of churches, and just the continual oppression of the people. I mean, the whole social credit point thing, like that's insane. I sound like a valley girl there. Yeah, that's insane, and frankly, they deserve it. And I think it's quite fitting that such an arrogant regime would get punished by something which, for all intents and purposes, appears to either have been a vaccine gone wrong or a biological weapon. I've heard more evidence to suggest the former, but I really do think that it's quite fitting that this would undo Winnie the Pooh, whatever the name of the leader is. The guy whose name currently eludes me. As for the people on the ground, they don't deserve any of this, so far as I know, so just pray for them. I've been praying for them. That's all you can really do. And just wait. Because, there was nothing that people could do under the Black Death. There was nothing people could really do under the Spanish flu except for wait for it to burn itself out. And this is the kind of thing that will burn itself out pretty quickly, as far as I can tell. So, don't worry too much. If you get it, you get it. It's just how it is, Second thing I wanted to say is that I realised that I'm a little bit burnt out on spiritual reading. Because for about 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 months, pretty much all I was reading was spiritual reading. And that's probably why the content on this channel was so pointed towards that. But obviously, being called Renaissance Man, as cringe as a name as that is, I'm trying to give as much information on all kinds of things as possible. So at the moment, I'm going to move back into financial books, habit books, maybe to a lesser extent, philosophical books. But I think I'm pretty much beaten to death the basics of Christian spirituality in a way that I will never be able to top until I am in the illuminative stage of spirituality. So there's like 3 stages. There's the purgative, illuminative, and unitive. And purgative is where you purge out your sins, and I'm far from that, so I don't really have any idea what to say beyond that. I'm not going to make any grand statements about theology beyond maybe the one that I did the other day, the one on Witnessing True Beauty, which is basically just a more poetic summation of Hugh of St. Victor's On the Trinity, which is a profound book that everyone should read. I had it summed up to me by a Franciscan professor of history. Beautiful work. But yeah, I'm not going to make any grand stepping into theology for quite a while because I'm kind of burnt out on it. Although I will say one thing. One hilarious statement I've heard out of, I think it was Father Mark Goering, was that how the traditionalists are calling themselves like tradismatics and Trentecostals, and I think this is quite funny because especially the Trentecostals one, because it is so fitting, like there's a lot I could say about the trad channels, and Goering is great. But there are other ones, I'm sure you can think of a few, maybe some of the larger ones, that they frankly are not the most charitable people on the planet. So I'm going to be distancing more from that as well. The sorts of people who say, oh, Pope Francis has done something mean today. Please buy my book, Subversion, how Matthew 16 is completely irrelevant in today's age, like you know the sorts of people, welcome to the vortex where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. Anyway, enough of me going on about this. Basically, I'm going to try and make more of a move towards financial stuff and habitual stuff. If you like that, obviously you'll be commenting. I'd actually quite like to hear some comments on an idea I have. I'm thinking of changing the Patreon from something that's a subscription service into something where people can ask me questions and like talk to me in person, because I found that I was using a lot of time on Discord and helping people for, generally for free, but it was also dragging down my frankly, it was making me sin more because it was an attachment. So I figured that I'd like to help people more, but I need some way of some way of actually getting a return on it. So like nothing too much. Like, the $5 a month will stay the way it is. But if you need help, I'll try and set up calls with people who need help through that. So let me know what you think of that. Okay? Obviously, go to your spiritual directors and priests first. Don't trust a random voice on the internet over them. They've got training. I don't. I've just sat down and read a bunch of books and, whacked my own way through certain things. So let's start with the questions. The first one from Alphonse Macmillan says, how to communicate with and hopefully bring around the pagan/alt-right types. They've ended up that way because they're somewhat aware of what's happening, but more how to steer them away from racial idolatry and to more traditionalist and Christian outlooks. Well, the thing I've realised, and this is mainly why I started up the channel, is that most people don't read. Most people are caught up in, the spirit of the age, the spirit of what people are saying. And this flows from the content creators primarily. This flows from content creators, this flows from the mainstream media. The trouble is that most content creators, myself included, don't read enough. We don't have enough original ideas because we don't sit down and read. And the way things are at the moment, and perhaps it's somewhat, a positive feedback from, human nature, is that we only read things that we like. The bigger channels, people like, the Golden One, Marcus Folan, he's really good. He's actually the reason I'm in shape now. Survive the Jive, obviously Varg Vicar, until I think is completely gone off YouTube. These sorts of pagan YouTubers, they'll sit down and they'll read somebody who is fundamentally kind of silly, like Evola, or if they're lucky they'll read Rene Guénon, but they'll never sit down and they'll never read the Gospels. They'll never sit down and they'll never read, say, the commentaries on them by the fathers, because they think that it's kind of erroneously some sort of subversion, which is ridiculous, which is patently ridiculous compared, like, if you actually go and read the history, even from the perspective of, say, Einhard, Einhard, the guy who wrote the life of Charlemagne, the wars against the pagans were brutal, but there wasn't really much in the way of subversion that went on. If anything, the priests that went out and converted the pagans were probably more assaulted than, like than the pagan traditions. There were some things where, like, the Druids were massacred, but they were massacred by the Romans. So, the death of the traditions often came at the end of the Romans, or the soldiers, as opposed to the actual priests and the people who believed. So, what I think would help with that is that, bearing in mind that the majority of people just simply won't sit and read about this thing because either they don't have time or they don't have the discipline, is to have people who are committed to this amongst the audience here on this channel go and produce their own content, interact with these pagan people, sit down and talk to them, and know their subjects and their arguments better than they do, and bring them over to it. And one of the best ways to do this is through humility. So I think Pope Francis actually said this, if you're going to preach the gospel, don't preach it in this kind of pharisaical, canon law says this kind of way. And I've known a number of people in real life who have done this. No, you need to do it through the growth in your own virtue. And I know from personal experience that this works. Because my own friends, people who are originally atheist, will openly invoke God now, by virtue of the fact that I have committed as much as I can, or as much as I'm aware that I can, to the Christian life, and they've seen that it is a superior form of life to atheism. And I suspect that a similar thing could happen with the pagan / alt-right types. The only thing, I think that the main thing though, for these sorts of people, is that you have to focus on growing them in charity, which is love of God, agape in Greek. Because if they love God more, and they recognize that these different racial groups they don't like are in the same likeness and image, and accept that, because they have to, because if they love God, then they believe the scriptures, that will make them less racist, so that will make them less prone to racial idolatry, and therefore more prone to the actual Christian mindset that comes from Roman Catholicism. Okay, the second question is from Pater Noster. What are your thoughts on the pagan and race realist elements of the traditional right? Well, I think that they don't really have the same aims as us. I don't think they even have aims. They don't have a tradition that exists. The writers themselves in this movement have pointed this out. They don't have their own movements, really. They just sort of invent things based on what they hear off YouTube channels and what those YouTube channels read out of books, you know. I think it was actually Survive the Jive that acknowledged this. Aside from that, I think that they aren't really of one with us. They're a different kind of traditionalist. So I think that they are just as much of an opponent, if not a very powerful one, as, say, I don't know, perhaps secularism. They're just as much of as an opponent, but they are more open to the way of thinking that perhaps traditional Christianity thinks, in the sense that they're actually genuinely endeavouring to try and find, that original tradition, which is manifest in Roman Catholicism. I've met people, again, in real life, who have ended up in the same church as I am through precisely that route. So we have to bear that in mind. We cannot despise any people for any group that they're in, as well. That's something that I think is often forgotten online. We often do us versus them, but we have to remember that these people are in the likeness and image of God likewise, and that they're just as wounded as we are. And so, therefore, they need a physician. They need a physician, not a brick through the window. So acknowledge that, and, go talk to them. So, another person asks, I'm not going to read your name out, and I think you fully know why. I'm going to read out your last two questions. The other two, I don't really have an opinion on, and I don't think it's really relevant. How can young people properly delve into reading the early church fathers? And are there any authors especially worth reading as an introduction? There is a book that I've heard of called The Fathers Know Best, which I haven't read, but I've heard good things about. But my way of getting into the church fathers was mostly in that I had a problem I needed solving. So, for example, I needed to decide on whether or not papal primacy and papal supremacy were legitimate, whether they had legitimate historical foundations. So I went through the encyclicals of the popes in the 3rd century and read them, and it's like, oh, okay, it does. In fact, it makes Eastern Orthodoxy look kind of ridiculous. Other questions like, let's say, I know, the hypostatic union. So how God is both man and God. Well, Christ is both man and God in one physis, or one body. Well, I went and read St. Cyril of Alexandria relating to that. Essentially, you've got to grow it organically. There's no sense in just reading the early church fathers just like blat. A lot of the things that I've realised over the last year is that most good change, most positive change happens organically. So you have a problem and you solve it. So if you want to read the early church fathers, the best place probably to start, and I think this is a problem with most people online, is how authority works within the church, and then you have motivation to go and read on about how the authority works. So you can start with Ignatius of Antioch's epistles. St. Ignatius, yeah. Let me think. Oh, I want to have a better prayer life. I want to start with mental prayer. Go and read the Desert Fathers. There's a lot of works from them, actually. Go read the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and then maybe the Lawsiac history. Let me think. How do I become a good family man? St. John Chrysostom wrote at least one treatise on that. You can't just full stop read the fathers. You need a reason, a concrete reason in your life why you need to know them. And the great thing about the Fathers is that they're exceedingly practical. There are some parts of some theologians, say like, I don't want to say Garrigou Lagrange, but he's the one that sort of springs to mind, that are a little bit dry and not really applicable much to real life in like a direct way. Perhaps parts of like the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae by Aquinas, like commentaries on like the Trinity and stuff that aren't really immediately applicable to people's lives, and so you don't really have much motivation to read them unless you're like really, really interested in that sort of thing. However, there are other parts, like, I don't know, the questions on lust that Aquinas wrote in Secunda Partis of the Summa. Those things are immediately applicable, because when you know what lust is, then you can fight it. And his other question is, how can young men who wish merely to grow in virtue, as you seek to do, cast off politics and political ideological thinking? Well, it's really simple. Just stop reading it. Just cut it out of your life. If it's out of sight, it will be out of mind very quickly. That's my opinion on it, really. I don't know what else you can really do beyond get some self-control on what you're reading. Because it's really important to choose and discern what you are going to read. There's no sense going and reading like Archaeofuturism by Guillaume Fay if you're not interested in the Nouveau Droit or something like that. If you're in, like, just stop reading that kind of thing. If you're gonna try and cast off politics. Also, stop associating with people who talk about it constantly. That's another good one. Next question is from Isaac Miller. Are you an advocate of W thinking? Now, I had to actually search up what this is. So, apparently W thinking, according to the Urban Dictionary, great source I know, is when a man or woman feels without shadow of doubt and only circumstantial evidence that they could have relations with another person, often referred to as a slam dunk or tenant thinking. No, I mean, you shouldn't be thinking in those terms if you are just, approaching a person. I know how hard it is to control that. I'm awful for that kind of thing. But, yeah. No, I'm not an advocate of W thinking. I think you should, I think this is one thing I'm learning over time. Because of the sort of the circles I was hanging out with and because of my own mental susceptibilities, I became very interested in going to bars and just talking to birds, and just saying, well, I could, have a... But that's not a healthy way of thinking, and it doesn't get anything done. So I'm trying to stamp that out. As much as that's a difficult thing to do, being a young man, it's something that I think we should all strive to do. Okay, another question from Alphonse Macmillan. Also, thoughts and solutions for the large number of English women converting to Islam. I live in the southwest and I see a lot of white women in traditional Muslim dress. I find it hard to dislike them given how Western men have abandoned our post and failed them. They're also very polite and kind. I deal with them a lot in my job. Any hopes of bringing them back to Christ? Well, it's really simple. Become better men. You need to motivate women to stay in the church. You can't just expect them to stay. Because the thing with churches that I've noticed is that there's a lot of men who are very kind of beta, I guess. And that's just because of how they're raised. We're all raised in that kind of way. But that doesn't really inspire anyone. That doesn't inspire a woman. This doesn't inspire a guy. So we're in somewhat of a privileged position online to have access to how the authentic Christian tradition was lived. And we know that it's an objectively healthier way of living than is advocated now. This much is self-evident. We didn't have 50% of the population or whatever on antidepressants. We didn't have the same level of mental illness in, say, 1650 as we do now, in spite of, like, the 30 Years' War. So, just go and live as man is supposed to. Go and watch Father Chad Ripperger's lectures. There's a reason why he's called Father Chad. And live that. And then, over time, women will gravitate because they sense that it's men actually living as men are supposed to be. And, we love a feminine woman. Someone who's living in accordance with what it means to be a woman. Women love a man who lives in accordance with what it means to be a man. So just do that. That's all I can really suggest. And the reason why these women are, going over to Islam is because, frankly, Muslim men live more in line with what it means to be a man than the average white fella in Britain. So this needs to change. There's a lot of questions from this R Drive Studios guy. It says lastly on this, but I'm gonna omit that. I've not omitted it that well, have I? Are playing video games and role-playing games where you're the bad guy and commits crimes such as theft and murder immoral or even sinful? I obviously have no desire to do it in real life. I don't think so. It might influence your mindset on a certain level, and it might be a good idea to avoid it for that, but I think this is just scrupulosity. I think you just need to chill a bit. Although, granted, I don't really play video games that much. I played about 6 hours of video games in the last 2 or 3 months. I don't really play many. I sort of got out of the groove of it. Although I am enjoying a really good game of Medieval 1 at the moment. Okay, Eagle X Prince asks, do you believe that we, as America, should switch to monarchy and have an anointed prophet speaking to God for the king, basically having God intervene in our country's decision-making? Because we aren't doing so good without God's help. Well, we have the Pope for that, first of all, and secondly, we can't just rip off the Book of Judges just completely organically, because that's just not how it works. God ordains these sorts of things, and God operates in those sorts of ways. Imitating God in how you run a country which uses a system which was in place 3,000 years ago, I'm not sure that would make sense to do organically, so no. Dave Skeet said, who are some of your heads of state in history? Roman dictator, medieval kings, biblical figures, Austrian corporals, etc. Heads of state, I mean, Winston Churchill. I think this is just this may be a flaw in the English, so I'm just going to assume, who do I look up to? I think this is what it means. The prophet Elijah, the prophet Jeremiah, these very, very hard men. I was reading into St. Francis de Sales the other day. He's very interesting. St. Louis IX. Obviously Jesus. Marcus Atilius Regulus. I mean, I made a load of videos on these sorts of people. At the moment, people who are alive right now, probably Jocko Willink. What's his name? David Goggins. That's another one. The books written by those two are really good. Aside from that, I can't really think of any. What would be the best way to get over a girl? Well, I've never had a long-term girlfriend. I think the most I've ever managed is 2 dates before getting sick of the woman. Frankly. That's my arrogance speaking there. Just stop thinking about her. Do other things. You know, time heals all wounds. Pray for healing and avoid. Okay, so Zeph in Felix asks why people are obsessed with the aesthetics of the world instead of the beauty of God. Because they don't acknowledge God to exist. That's why. Simple. Austin, what is your favourite colour? And why? I like orange because I like orange. I don't really give myself... I have better things to think about. Matt11, is that an L? LZ asks, how do you overcome scrupulosity? Sometimes I feel like the confession isn't valid. I forgot to say a minor detail, even though the priest has a strong grasp of the sin committed. All scrupulosity is arrogance. God forgives all sins. So acknowledge that and trust in the plan, bucko. Ask for faith. I can't tell you I can't be a spiritual director, first of all, because I'm not qualified to do such. And secondly, I don't know you. So I'll only speak in the general tones that I've gotten out of the books I've read, and yeah, essentially scrupulosity is just another form of arrogance. Like thinking that the all-powerful God can't overcome your sins. I mean, come on, man. Antonio Clemente asks, can we find beauty in a mundane, normal life, or must we all strive to be polymaths? Well, I mean, all lives are mundane and normal because all life is habit. It's just that there are some habits that tend to polymathery and some that don't. I think everyone should be a polymath as much as they can be, because why wouldn't you want to learn about the world in general? You could admire beauty without that as well. Like, it doesn't take, 170 IQ or whatever to admire the world. You know, they're like some of the people who have observed beauty, the greatest are some of the thickest. Sort of don't forget, you know, we were happier when more people couldn't read. Now, obviously they're not connected. But what I'm saying is that, you know, being intelligent and being well read doesn't suddenly make the world happier, but I certainly wouldn't say the opposite either. So just, learn to meditate on things. One thing that I've noticed that works quite well is that if maybe you're like, you've got a bit of downtime, and you notice a particular object in the environment, and what you should do is you should sit and meditate on how that reflects God. So, for example, you see a chair. How does it reflect God? Well, it's sturdy, it's comforting to the person sitting in it, etc., etc. If you do that, you'll notice beauty in the mundane and normal life that we have. Another question from R Drive Studios. Do you think that there's any hope of saving the West in its present form, or is our best hope to preserve the Church and hope it serves a similar role as it did after the fall of Rome, preserving knowledge and culture? Well, what does it mean to save the West? Like, the West isn't this static construct. It's something that's always changing with the people and with the way people are thinking. So you're not going to save the West from a computer anyway, even if like the West is something. I mean, Christendom, you could say, is something, and that's something that you can protect, but the West is such a meaningless term. Just be a good person. That's all you can do. Another question from the guy. Have you ever read the works of Julian the Apostate? No. And if so, what are your thoughts of him? He seems to be pretty red-pilled in his arguments against Christianity, but his arguments against Christianity are monopagan and cringe tier. Well, yeah, he tried to do like pagan bishops, which was weird if I remember correctly. I think he was just kind of like, you're not my real dad, from what little I know of him. The Imperium of Keg asks, do you agree with my theory? Religion and morality is a way for people to organise in the face of hardship. Without hardship, one can get away with being immoral. Only the constant threat of starvation can keep people moral. No. And just go and look at the history of the Black Death. And look at the literary works that came out of the Black Death. The Decameron. Like, something that actually kind of shocked me as to how immoral it was for something written in the 14th century. I think that people organising in the face of hardship is something that comes out of morality, because morality is just practical living. That's all it was until the 19th century, when people decided to just make it about feelings. But, God revealed a religion. Like, religion is ultimately the set of rules that society follows. So it's not so much organising in the face of hardship as organising full stop. I don't know what really else I can contribute to that question. Domestic Crusade asks, hello, I'm a relatively new subscriber, so I'm wondering what is your position on Vatican II, the SSPX, and State of Vacantism. I am an Anglican looking to swim the Tiber and only have Novus Ordo churches around. Regards. Go to Novus Ordo Church, because that's your local community. It doesn't matter if they have a guitar. It doesn't matter if there's, female altar servers. That's just how things are. God is truly present in those churches, because that is what the church came to the conclusion under Vatican II of. That is how the church is. And people who spurg, like a lot of the SSPX, and especially the State of Occultists, right? Like, first of all, they lack charity. Second of all, they're disobedient. This is one of the problem I have with these trads. They're just really disobedient towards the hierarchy. And, imagine that, right? Like, you have all of these different writings by saints. You could have gone and read Cyril of Alexandria. You could have read Athanasius of Alexandria. You could have gone and read, St. Bede. Go and read The Life of St. Cuthbert. I just finished that. That's really good. And instead you decide to read Taylor Marshall. Come on, guys. And you think that, this is the thing that I've seen, particularly with some of the people that I've known in real life. They're the kind of people who will look down their nose at the priest because he's a little bit, hippie-ish on first, interaction. Like, oh, he seems like a libtard. I'm just going to ignore him. That's not how things work, and that's never how they've worked. That is never how they've worked. And yet, these trads, in their temerity, think that they can overrule them? Like, are there bad bishops? Are there heretical bishops? Yes, because there always has been. Are there bad cardinals? Yes, there are. Is Pope Francis not the visible head of the church? Obviously he is the visible head of the church. Like that. This is what was decided on, and this is what we're going to do. And any questioning of that is above your pay grade and indicates a vice, the vice of curiosity, that seeking of knowledge that is not becoming your station. You know, I have these, like, there are a lot of these little girlies who are in their, like, mid-20s, right, or their early 20s, and a lot of guys who are like this as well, who think that they know the left, right, and bloody centre of whether or not the Pope is real or not. And they pretend as if they can throw their weight around with these priests who've spent 40 years, like, teaching in seminaries, or, you know, preaching the faith. And they think that they know better because they've read an article by Taylor Marshall. Like, this is the problem of the trads, and this is why I don't consider myself a trad. Because they're arrogant people, and arrogance is the highest vice. It's the reason that Satan fell. I'm gonna stop talking about the trads because they wind me up something rotten. Okay? Like, yeah. Like, oh, like, there are certain parishes that are bad, yes. Just like, you know, go and read stuff that isn't bad, and you'll be fine. And if it's really that bad, then ask the priest, hey, I think this is an error, and then explain why. And then if he's a decent priest, he'll, like, talk to you. If he, like, screams at you, you might want to go one step higher, go to the presbyter or the bishop, you know? But, like, just chill. Our Drive asks, do you think the church should focus on exporting the faith to new regions such as Africa or in China, or retaining membership in the West? I think that because we speak English, our primary obligation is to spread the faith in the West. China, it is clearly growing. I think the coronavirus will only spread Christianity further long term, and Africa has some of the most hardcore Christians I've ever seen. I don't think we need to worry about them. I think we need to worry about our own backyard, because it's, you know, it's like, what was it, a sea of godlessness? St. Pope John Paul II called it. Yeah. Okay. CDA8 asks, do you believe that religious accelerationists are doing God's work? No, because God will accelerate it at exactly the speed he wants it at. Are in his plan when it comes to the professing of the world. I've heard a lot of mixed responses to this. You shouldn't be an accelerationist, but if you are going to be an accelerationist, then God's going to use you in the way that brings his plan to perfection. But that's all I have to say on this. The Imperium of Question asks, again, Peterson says that the meek shall inherit the earth is a mistranslation. It's more like those who have weapons and know how to use them, but choose not to will inherit the earth. Do you agree with that? Well, I think it's one of these things where the meaning of words changes. You know, like love has entirely changed in its meaning since when it was used in the scriptures. And likewise, meek. When we think of meek people, we tend to think of these cowardly, kind of nerdish people. They are never going to inherit the earth because they are nerds. As I have made in my video on nerds. You don't inherit the earth through being cowardly. I think that Jordan Peterson is probably closer to that, but I'm no scripture scholar. CDA8 asks, do you believe a return to modesty is realistic? Yes, if you choose to practice it. If not, how can we best emulate and spread the truth when it seems that the world is actively hunting out for every other lie? Just behave modestly. Oh no. Okay, I'm going to ignore that question there. What does it mean, the phrase adultery of the heart, mean, and how can we avoid it? Basically, fight your lustful thoughts. Because everyone has them. You just have to sit down and actively fight them. And they will maul you to death if you're not careful. What are some strategies you would suggest to combat progressive influence in local churches? Be the most virtuous person in the room, and people will gravitate to you. Should traditional Catholics seek to ally with other traditional movements across the world? What do you mean by that? Like, traditional Christian? Well, yeah, I mean, insofar as they prevent things like abortion, sure. But, I mean, insofar as it would lead to us compromising our beliefs, then no. In your opinion, what is the ultimate red pill? The ultimate red pill is that the red pill's a meme. Imperium of Keck. A lot of repeated questions, because it's just the way that the YouTubers organise the comments, so I'm just getting them in kind of a random order. Like, it's not even in time order, it's really weird. If Christianity is wiped out by Islam, does that make Islam right? Well, Christianity won't be wiped out by Islam, so there you go. But even if it was, it wouldn't make Islam right. It's like saying, would, I don't know, does that make Cain right that he killed Abel? Is Harry Potter good for kids? If not, why? No, because it's poor quality literature. Like, a lot of people screech about demonic influence or whatever in it. No, like even if there was, it's just poor quality literature. I don't know why it's so hard to get through people's heads. Thoughts on Brexit? I'm glad that it's over. I voted to leave. This is from Duffmatic, by the way. I voted to leave. I was really committed on UKIP, and then I quit, and then I decided I didn't care about politics. But I'm glad that it's happened, regardless. Which video are you most proud of? I actually don't know. I think that my audiobook on the Book of Sirach I quite like doing. That's certainly something that I guess I'd say I'm proud of. But that's behind Renaissance Man, You can get dozens of hours of audiobook content on there if you pay your $5 a month. Hold to tradition. Do you believe swearing is a sin? Yes. It's a venial sin. And it's hard for me to control that, but it's just, it is a sin regardless. The Imperium of Keck says, can you or should you oust the Pope? No. No, lol. Trap Jams asks, genetic entropy or evolutionary theory? I think this is a question above most people's pay grades. But what I would say is that to proponents of evolutionary theory, I can't speak for entropy because I'm assuming that's like the loss of genetic information over time. I don't know enough about it. So proponents of evolutionary theory, I'd suggest they go and read De Anima or On the Soul by Aristotle and try and square that circle. Because personally, it's not something I've really devoted much thought to, but that book certainly opened a lot of doors that I otherwise wouldn't have noticed. Right, okay. I'm going to refresh and see if there are any new questions. Because heaven knows I might well have had some guy go a bit nuts. I don't think there are. I don't think there are. Okay. Yeah, there aren't any. Okay. So I hope that everyone here kind of found that somewhat interesting or enlightening or whatever buzzword you come up for this. Please tell me what you think of different things in the comments. I might well do another one of these soon as well if there are enough questions and it's not the same people asking them, because if it's the same people asking, just send me a DM on Discord, man. Like, I don't need to sit here and record and spend like 20-30 gig of my hard drive recording these. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.